The chamber was built to make everyone feel small. 300 meters of vaulted ceiling. Black stone benches carved from a single asteroid. The acoustics were engineered so that a whisper from the front podium arrived at every seat like a voice from inside your own skull. 47 species had sent delegates here. 47 species sat now in that specific kind of silence that only exists when something historic is about to happen. And everyone knows it, and nobody wants to be the one who breathes too loud. Then the humans walked in. There were two of them, a woman and a young man carrying a briefcase. The woman was Colonel Adaeze Okafor. She was Nigerian-born, third-generation military, and she walked like someone who had already been in this exact argument 17 times and found it exhausting each time. She sat down at the defendant's table, looked briefly around the room, and opened a thermos of coffee. The chamber watched this, the way you watch someone start eating at a funeral. High Arbiter Verit Sul cleared his throat. He was a tall species, the Veth, 2.5 meters of pale gray skin and eyes that sat too far apart on his face to feel comfortable looking at directly. He had presided over this tribunal for 60 years. He had never seen a defendant bring a hot beverage. He decided to proceed. Colonel Okafor. His voice came out of every corner of the room at once. The Galactic Compact's War Ethics Tribunal is now in session. Earth's 14th Expeditionary Force stands accused of multiple violations of the Lex Bellum Universalis, the Universal Combat Accords, during active operations in the Karath sector over the past 11 months. He paused. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings? I do. Then we will begin with the charges. The first charge was the use of non-combatants in a war zone. The Accords were very clear on this. Any individual without a registered combat designation was a protected class, untouchable. You did not put them near a battlefield, you did not use them in support roles that exposed them to fire, and you absolutely did not arm them. The humans had sent medics into active combat zones. Medics who were, according to the Compact's observers, carrying weapons. 3 of them had engaged enemy forces directly. The Kethvi delegate, Elder Soroth, had 8 limbs and the kind of stillness that very old soldiers develop when they stop needing to perform being calm. He watched Okafor as the charge was read. She did not react. The second charge was deception at scale. The Accords allowed battlefield deception at a ratio of 1 false signal per 4 real ones. Enough to keep war from being completely predictable, while still keeping it from becoming pure theater. Earth's forces had run deception operations at a ratio of 1 to 300. Supply ships pretending to be warships. Warships broadcasting as empty freighters. Entire phantom battalions that existed only as signals on enemy sensors. The Vreth Makal Ambassador, a 4-handed species whose hands had not stopped moving since the session began, leaned forward at this one. The Vreth Makal had been on the receiving end of those phantom battalions. They had spent 6 weeks responding to an army that did not exist while the real one dug in behind them. The third charge was violation of the cessation window. The Accords required a 40-hour pause between engagements, a cooling period, time to recover the wounded, collect the dead, re-establish communication with command, a mercy. Earth's forces had used every hour of those 40 hours to dig trenches, tunnels, fortified positions that shouldn't have been possible in 40 hours, except that the humans had treated the ceasefire like a construction deadline and worked in rotating shifts around the clock. Soroth's 8 hands were very still. The fourth charge was psychological operations against a surrendering force. This one was not a procedural matter. This was in the Accords as a moral absolute. You did not psychologically break an enemy that was already giving up. There was no debate, no ratio, no exception clause. The humans had broadcast to a Vreth Makal unit that was in the process of surrendering a detailed audio recording of their most significant defeat from 2 months prior, on a loop for 11 hours. The Vrethmakal ambassador had gone from shaking to very still. In his species, very still was worse. The fifth charge was voluntary self-sacrifice as tactical doctrine. This one had caused 3 species to file secondary protests. The Accords prohibited using living soldiers in roles where death was the intended outcome. It was a dignity clause. You did not order people to die. You sent them into danger. That was unavoidable. But death could not be the plan. Earth had sent soldiers into high-risk operations where command's own internal projections listed a 60 to 70% mortality rate. The soldiers had volunteered. Then the ones who survived had volunteered again. The Kethvi had fought wars for 12,000 years. Elder Soroth had personally participated in 4 of them. He had seen courage. He had seen fanaticism. He had seen desperation so deep it looked like both. He did not have a category for this. The Chamber's legal advocate, a Veth-born jurist named Veth Primary Ale, finished reading the charges and looked up. Colonel Okafor, the compact asks how Earth responds to these violations. Okafor had been looking at her coffee. She looked up now. She had a face that didn't perform anything. Not confidence, not concern, not the diplomatic blankness that most species representatives trained into themselves for proceedings like this. She just looked like someone who was present and paying attention. "I'd like to start with the last charge on your list," she said. "The one you haven't read yet." Ale checked his records. There was in fact one more. He read it. During the siege of Karath Station, Earth forces had broadcast a message to the Vrethmakal command. The message listed, in full, every tactical advantage the 14th Expeditionary currently possessed. Every weapon system, every troop count, every supply line, every position. It was a full disclosure of force. Under compact law, a full disclosure of force was the formal signal of surrender. The universal admission that you had nothing left to hide and were asking for terms. Except Earth forces had attacked 6 hours later. The Vrethmakal ambassador stood up. He did it slowly, the way someone stands when their body has more to say than words do. "You signaled surrender," he said, "and then you attacked." The chamber had the word for what that was. It had words in 47 languages, and every translation meant roughly the same thing. The worst thing you can do. The thing that makes war impossible. The act that breaks the only agreements that keep war from being just extinction by another name. Okafor looked at him. "That broadcast," she said, "was not a surrender signal." The chamber waited. It was a courtesy. Nobody spoke. The acoustics carried the silence perfectly. To every bench, to every delegate, to 47 species sitting in the specific stillness of people who have just realized the ground under them is a different shape than they thought. Okafor's aide opened the briefcase. Inside was a document. 300 pages. Printed on paper. Actual paper. The kind no civilization had used in 600 years. He set it on the table. Nobody moved toward it. Nobody quite wanted to be first. The document had a cover page. The title read, "Doctrine of Necessary Extremity, Earth Sovereign Addendum to the Lex Bellum Universalis, filed under Article 7, Section 3, Subsection 9 of the Compact Charter." Subsection 9. Most of the delegates had to look it up. Even Arbiter Verith Sul, who had spent 60 years in this chamber, pulled up the charter text on his personal interface and read the subsection twice before he said anything. Subsection 9 allowed any civilization that signed the Accords to attach its own military doctrine as a co-equal legal instrument. The document you filed under subsection 9 had the same legal standing as the Accords themselves. It could not override the Accords, but where the Accords left room for interpretation, a subsection 9 filing filled that room with law. It had been written into the Charter by the founders 4,000 years ago. Something for older civilizations whose war traditions predated the Accords, and needed a formal way to bridge the gap. No one had ever used it for anything significant. The founders had assumed any civilization new enough to the compact would take time to understand its laws before trying to work within them. The filing timestamp on Earth's doctrine of necessary extremity was 11 days after humanity signed the Accords. Day 11. Ale read the timestamp 3 times. Then he put his interface down on the table, with a very specific kind of care. The care of someone whose hands are not completely steady. You filed this, he said, before your first engagement under compact observation. Before our second one, Okafor said. We had a small border dispute in the outer Karath system 11 days in. We filed the doctrine on the morning before that engagement. You had been a member of the compact for 11 days. We read fast. Chi Voss of the Peleron hegemony spoke from the 3rd row. The Peleron were the oldest surviving civilization at the table, not counting the Voth, who were so old they had mostly stopped counting. And Chi Voss had the particular quality of stillness that comes from representing a species that had seen everything at least once. Walk us through it, she said. Not hostile, something more unsettling than hostile, genuinely curious. Okafor opened the doctrine to the first annotated section. The non-combatant charge first. The Accords defined a non-combatant as any individual without a registered combat designation. The humans had sent personnel without combat designations into a war zone, and some of those personnel had fired weapons. Earth's doctrine defined a non-combatant differently. Under Earth law, a non-combatant was not determined by designation. It was determined by choice. An individual who had chosen in full knowledge not to take a combat role was protected. An individual who had chosen to accept the risks of a combat-adjacent role, who had signed forms, who had cross-trained, who had made an informed and voluntary decision, was not a non-combatant, regardless of their official designation. The medics who had entered the war zone had all cross-trained in 3 weapon systems. They had all filed what Earth's military called combat election forms, a document stating that the individual understood their role carried combat risk and accepted it. Your Accords protect the unwilling, Okafor said. Earth has very few unwilling. Soroth of the Kethvi turned this over in his head for a moment. Then he set it aside and waited for the next one. He had the instincts of someone who knew when an argument was structurally correct, even when it felt wrong. And he knew better than to get stuck on the first one. The deception charge was next. The 1-to-4 ratio. The humans had operated at 1-to-300. Earth's doctrine separated battlefield deception, individual false signals used at the tactical level, during or immediately before an engagement, from operational deception, which it defined as deception conducted at the campaign level across multiple engagements over time. The Accords capped battlefield deception ratios. They said nothing about operational deception, because the founders had never written a cap for something they had never thought to categorize separately. The Phantom Battalions. The warships broadcasting as empty freighters. All of it was operational in scale, not tactical. All of it was, under the doctrine, unaddressed by the Accords. Ale's expression did something complicated. He was a good jurist. He had built his career on finding the places where law was airtight. He was, right now, looking at a gap so large you could park a fleet in it, and the realization was arriving in stages, each one worse than the last. The cessation window, Delegate Farron of the Murath said from the left bench. He was a small species, the Murath, and he asked questions with the bluntness of someone who had learned that small species could not afford diplomatic softness. The digging. The 40-hour pause used to build fortifications. There's nothing interpretive there. You dug. That's preparation for combat. That violates the spirit of the pause. Okafor said, the Accords specify that the cessation window prohibits combat operations and the movement of armed forces. Digging is not a combat operation. Moving Earth from one place to another isn't classified as armed force movement. It's preparation. The Accords don't regulate preparation, they regulate action. She paused. If you want to regulate preparation, you'll need to amend Article 14. We'd be happy to participate in that discussion. Farron sat back. The Vreth Makal ambassador, his name was Garrett. Okafor had made a point of learning it before she walked into this chamber, had been listening without speaking. Now he spoke. The psychological operations, he said, against my soldiers, who were surrendering. This one Okafor had not interrupted during the reading. She did not interrupt now. She let him finish. Your forces played recordings of their worst defeat on a loop for 11 hours while they were trying to surrender. Whatever legal argument you make, whatever the doctrine says, tell me how that is anything other than cruelty. The room was quiet. Okafor looked at him steadily. It isn't, she said. A pause that landed like a stone in still water. The doctrine doesn't make an argument for that action. That was a field decision made by a commanding officer under conditions I was not present for. If your government wants to file a separate conduct complaint against that officer, we will not contest it. Garrett looked at her for a long time. Something shifted in his face. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something more like the expression of a person who expected a wall and found a door, and wasn't sure yet what was on the other side. Chivas came back to the one everyone was circling. The broadcast, she said, the full disclosure. You signaled surrender and attacked. The doctrine cannot redefine surrender signals. Those are compact-wide protocol, not subject to individual interpretation. We didn't interpret it as a surrender signal, Okafor said. We didn't know it was one. The chamber did something that had no clean name. It collectively held a thought at arm's length and examined it. You claimed ignorance, Ale said slowly. We documented it, in real time. Internal communications, time-stamped, showing that command had not been briefed on Vreth Makal full disclosure protocol, and believed the broadcast was a battle declaration. She turned a page in the doctrine. The Accords require that a surrender signal be recognized as such. You cannot respond to an unrecognized signal. We have documentation that it was not recognized. You had been in contact with the Vreth Makal for 14 months, Chivas said. Yes. 14 months is enough time to learn surrender protocols. It should be, Okafor agreed. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The gap between should be and was sat in the room like furniture. Ale stood. He was a good jurist. He knew what was coming before he said it, and he said it anyway because it was the right question. This doctrine, he said, you filed it on day 11. You had been a member of the Compact for 11 days. You had no experience of combat under Compact law, no history of violations to respond to, no cases to learn from. He looked at the document on the table. Which means you didn't write this in response to anything that happened. You wrote it before anything happened. You read the Accords, and you saw, in advance, every place where you would need protection. Which means you knew, before you ever fought a single battle, under Compact observation, exactly how you were going to fight them. He looked up. You knew you would fight this way, and you signed the Accords anyway. The chamber waited. Okafor had not reached for her coffee in the last 40 minutes. She reached for it now, took a slow sip, and set it back down. We knew how we fight, she said. Yes. Then the document isn't a legal defense. It's a confession that was filed before the crime. The word crime landed hard. It was the best point anyone had made in 2 days. Okafor looked at him with something that wasn't quite warmth, and wasn't quite anything else that had a simple name. That, she said, is an interesting way to look at it. She folded her hands on the table. We'd like to suggest another one. Day 2. The chamber looked the same. The black stone benches, the impossible ceiling, the acoustics that made every word feel like it was being said directly into your ear by someone you couldn't quite see. But the room had a different weather to it now. Day 1. 47 species had come here to correct something. A young civilization had misbehaved. The Accords existed precisely for moments like this. A formal structure that said, this is how war works, and these are the consequences when you decide it doesn't apply to you. Day 2. 47 species were sitting with the slow and uncomfortable feeling of people who have picked up what they thought was a simple stone and found it heavier than it had any right to be. Nobody said this out loud. They didn't have to. Okafor arrived at the same time as the previous morning. Same thermos, same aide, with the same briefcase. She sat down, checked something on her personal interface, and waited. Saroth of the Kethvi had been in the chamber for an hour before the session started. Just sitting, thinking. 8 hands, very still. He spoke first when Arbiter Vareth Sul opened proceedings. Article 17, he said. He had a voice that made other sounds in the room briefly seem unnecessary. I want to address Article 17. Article 17 was the Dignity Clause. The one that said you did not send soldiers into roles where death was the plan. The one that had caused 3 separate secondary protests. The one that the Kethvi, who had been fighting wars since before humans had discovered fire, had co-authored 4,000 years ago. Article 17, Saroth said, prohibits the use of living combatants in suicidal tactical roles. The humans sent soldiers into operations where their own command projected 60 to 70% mortality rates. This isn't a definitional argument. This is a moral one. Soldier life has value. War requires that we agree on this, or war becomes something we cannot come back from. He looked at Okafor. No legal document changes that. Okafor looked back at him. Define suicidal, she said. Saroth did not expect this. He had been a soldier for longer than Earth had been a spacefaring civilization. He had not expected to be asked to define a word he had used for 12,000 years. A role, he said slowly, where death is intended or expected. Saroth stopped. They're the same. They aren't. Her voice was patient, not the patience of someone who is performing patience. The patience of someone who has actually thought this through and found a place to stand on it. Intention means death is the goal. Expected means probability suggests it's likely. Those are different things. At 60 to 70% mortality, our soldiers knew the numbers. They volunteered anyway. They didn't volunteer to die. They volunteered to do the job, knowing dying was the probable cost. That's not the same as intending to die. And every one of them who came back and volunteered for the next operation. The chamber was quiet enough that you could hear the ventilation system, which nobody had noticed before. Your article says, intended. Okafor opened the doctrine to the annotated section. Ours says these soldiers did not intend to die. The documentation supports this. Their mission objectives were not death. Death was the statistical probability they accepted in pursuit of the objective. She looked at Saroth directly. If you want to write an article that addresses expected mortality rates, we would engage with that conversation. But Article 17, as written, does not cover it. Saroth sat back. He did not argue. This was notable. He was not a man, not a being, who surrendered arguments easily. But he recognized a structurally correct position when he heard one, even when it made him feel like the floor had quietly shifted. He looked away. For the first time in the proceedings, he looked away. Ale Primary, the Compact's chief advocate, had been waiting for this moment. He had been building toward it since yesterday. He stood now, and he stood the way a person stands when they're about to say the thing they've saved. The doctrine itself, he said, let's return to it. He looked at the document on the table. Filed 11 days after signing, before any violations, before any combat history under compact law, before any of the incidents we're currently discussing had occurred. The argument has been made that the doctrine represents Earth, engaging in good faith with the legal framework, identifying potential conflicts, and filing for protection in advance. A reasonable civilization trying to work within the system. He turned to face Okafor. But if you had never fought a war under compact law, you could not have known which specific articles you would need protection from. The doctrine doesn't protect you from generic risk. It protects you from very specific articles, the exact articles that correspond to the exact violations now before this tribunal. He let that land. You didn't write this because you were trying to comply. You wrote it because you had already decided not to. You signed the accords knowing, on day one, that you would break them. The chamber leaned forward in the way that large groups of people do when something true has been said. It was, honestly, the best argument that had been made in 2 days. Okafor's age shifted slightly in his seat, the first movement from him in hours. Okafor did not shift. She sat exactly as she had sat for the past 2 days. Still, present, the kind of still that comes from environments so loud for so long that quiet becomes the most natural thing in the world. Then, she smiled. It was not a large smile. It wasn't the smile of someone who has won, or someone who is about to perform winning. It was the specific smile of someone who has finally arrived at a place they have been traveling toward for a long time, and find it is exactly as they left it in their memory. "You've studied our history," she said. Ael nodded. "Then you know what we are." She looked around the room. All of it. The 47 species, the black stone, the ceiling 300 meters up. We are the only species in this compact whose first tool was a weapon. Whose first organized activity, the very first thing our ancestors did when they found each other on a shared piece of land, was fight over it. We have been at war with something, each other, our planet, our food supply, our own bodies, for every century of our recorded history. The room listened. We didn't draft the doctrine because we planned to violate your accords. We drafted it because we read your accords and we recognized them. She looked at Ael. Every prohibition in that document, every banned tactic, every restricted doctrine, we've used them, all of them. At some point in our history, on our own planet, fighting each other, some group of humans found that tactic necessary. And then later, after enough time, after enough bodies, we decided the necessity wasn't worth it, and we wrote laws against it. She picked up the doctrine. These are your laws, but the things they prohibit, we invented most of them. We didn't need to study your accords to know what was in them. We just needed to recognize the shape of it. She set it back down. We weren't signing a foreign document. We were reading a translation of something we'd already written for ourselves and then forgotten. She looked at Ael. You asked how we knew on day 11 exactly which articles we needed protection from. We knew because we wrote the first version of those articles, in blood, long before you did. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from any that had come before it. Soroth was looking at the document. He had been a soldier for 12,000 years. He had fought with weapons, and with words, and with long silences in cold rooms. He knew what it felt like when the shape of something changed without moving. The doctrine was the same document it had been yesterday. It was a completely different object. Chi Voss of the Peloron spoke very quietly. You're saying you recognize the accords because your own history produced the same prohibitions. I'm saying the things your accords prohibit aren't prohibited because they don't work, Okafor said. They're prohibited because they work very well, and the cost of using them is something you can't pay and stay whole. She looked at the room. You all know that. You wrote the accords because you know that. We know it too. A pause. We just learned it more recently. Arbiter Verith Sewell called for the vote 2 hours later. 44-3 in favor of dismissal. The 3 who voted against were not disputing the legal argument. They were sitting with the thing the legal argument meant. That the accords were not an invention. They were a scar. And the species sitting at the defendant's table had just quietly shown every civilization in the room theirs. The scars were the same shape. Nobody had expected that. The dismissal of all charges took 11 minutes to formalize. The emergency session that followed took 6 hours. Nobody invited Earth. Okafor and her aide were shown to an anteroom on the eastern side of the station, a waiting room, comfortable enough, with a long window facing out into station orbit. 3 planets hung in the middle distance, like they had always been there and always would be, pale and still and indifferent to the things happening in this building. Her aide, Lieutenant Emeka Easy, sat down and opened his interface. He was 26 years old and very good at his job, which in this context meant he sat quietly and did not ask how she was feeling. She stood at the window. Inside the main chamber, 47 species were having a conversation that had no official agenda. This was notable. The Compact's deliberative body had operated by formal agenda for 4,000 years. Agenda was one of the things that separated organized civilization from a group of frightened beings in a room. Tonight they were frightened beings in a room. Soroth of the Kethvi spoke first. He usually did, in situations like this. Not because the Kethvi had the most political weight, the Peloran did, formally, but because Soroth had a quality that most beings in positions of power spent their entire careers trying to fake. He said the thing that was actually true, in the words it actually needed. "We have to talk about what the document means," he said. Chivos looked at him. "Legally the case is—" "Not legally." He cut her off clean. "Not unkindly. We know what it means legally. The charges were dismissed. The doctrine holds. That's finished." He looked around the room. "I mean, what the document means." Nobody asked him to explain. They had been sitting with it for 2 days, and some of them had been trying very hard not to look directly at it. "The Accords prohibit 42 categories of tactics," Soroth said. "Every species in this room helped draft those prohibitions. The prohibitions exist because at some point in our histories, we used those tactics. And then we stopped. And then we decided that stopping should be a rule, not just a choice." He paused. "Earth's doctrine identifies every one of those 42 categories, and files protective documentation for each of them." He let that sit. They recognized all 42. Delegate Farron of the Murats said, "They're a young civilization. They may have developed some of the same." "All 42, Soroth said again. "Not most of them, not a significant number. All of them. Every tactic this compact has ever decided was too costly to keep using, the humans found necessary at some point in their history on a single planet, fighting each other." He looked at the table. "We spread our wars across star systems. They fought theirs on one world. And they still found the same places we found, made the same choices, paid the same costs." Chivas was quiet for a long time. The Peloran had been a peace civilization for 2,000 years. They had art and philosophy and the most sophisticated diplomatic tradition in the Compact. They also had, in their oldest military archives, records of a period they called the Long Burning. 400 years during which the Peloran had done things to each other that they now did not teach in schools, except as the reason the Accords were necessary. Chivas knew those archives. She had read them once, when she was young, and thought she needed to understand what she was preventing. She had not read them again. "They're us," she said, 4,000 years ago. "Perhaps 3, said Elder Magistrate Corin of the Vath Dominion. He was the oldest being in the room, from the oldest civilization, and he spoke rarely enough that when he spoke, people rearranged themselves slightly to hear better. "My people were something similar 2,000 years before that. We don't speak about it, and I think possibly that has been a mistake." The room did something quiet and collective that had no good word for it. "They will grow out of it," Corin said. "Given time and reason and the proper structures, every civilization here has grown out of it. The Accords are part of that structure." He looked around the table. "The doctrine suggests that Earth understands this. They read our moral framework. They engaged with it. They built a legal bridge between what they are now and what the Accords ask them to become." Garret of the Vreth Makal had not spoken yet. He was thinking about a broadcast. about the 11 hours of recordings played to his soldiers while they tried to surrender, about the response he had given when Okafor, against everyone's expectations, had not defended it. She had said that was wrong, and we won't contest a conduct complaint. She hadn't needed to say that. The doctrine gave her enough cover to argue almost anything. She had said it anyway. The question that concerns me, Garrett said, is not whether they will change. I believe they will. The question is what we do in the time between now and then. He looked at Soroth. They are very effective at war. More effective than any new compact member in living memory. And they are still, by their own admission, operating by a doctrine that we have collectively decided is too costly. Yes, Soroth said. That is a danger. Yes, Soroth said again. He did not seem troubled by agreeing with this. They are a danger. A contained one currently. A manageable one, if we're thoughtful. He folded two of his hands on the table. Every species in this room was a danger once. Some of us required containment. Some of us required time. Some of us required loss. He looked at Garrett. You fought them for 11 months and came to a tribunal to file charges. You did not try to end them. That suggests you believe they can be managed too. Garrett did not answer immediately. I believe they can be talked to, he said finally. That's rarer than being manageable. In the anteroom, Okafor was still at the window. She had been standing there for 2 hours. Eze had stopped pretending to work on his interface and was looking at the same 3 planets she was looking at. Because after a while, the silence had that quality where the thing to do was just be in it. Do you think they're angry? He asked. Okafor thought about the session, about Soroth's 8 hands going still when the argument landed, about Chivas's voice going quiet at exactly the moments when quiet meant she was actually thinking, rather than performing thinking, about Garrett staying at the table when by rights he had every reason to leave. No, she said. Eze waited. The good kind. She looked at the 3 planets, the kind that means you're taking something seriously. Her notification screen lit up. The formal dismissal. They were free to leave. Eze sat up. Should we? Get me a refill first, she said. She kept looking at the planets. She had been a soldier for 22 years. She had been in enough rooms where the outcome mattered to know when a room had shifted in the right direction. And she had learned a long time ago that the right direction was not always the one that felt like winning. The chamber behind her was full of species sitting with a mirror they hadn't asked to look into. She understood the feeling. Earth had been looking into it for centuries and still hadn't figured out everything it saw. That was the thing nobody outside seemed to understand. The document on the table, all 300 pages of it, wasn't confidence. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't the record of the species that had decided the rules didn't apply to them. It was a map of everywhere they had already been. And a very honest accounting of how far they still had to go. 3 months later, Earth was invited back. Not to the main chamber. Not to the obsidian benches and the 300-meter ceiling. To a working room on the station's lower level. The kind of room that does the real business of any institution. The kind with bad lighting and a table covered in papers and the specific smell of beings who have been in the same space for too long, trying to solve something. 6 chairs, no ceremony, a water dispenser in the corner that made a sound like a question every time someone used it. Okafor arrived alone this time. She had not brought Eze. She had not brought the briefcase. She sat down across from Soroth of the Ketfi, who had brought Elder of Treaties Vosh and 1 aide. Chivas of the Peleron was there, with 2 junior delegates. Garrett of the Vreth Makal, and sent a single representative. His name was Arak. Okafor had read his file 3 times on the transport over. She found him interesting in the way she found most competent soldiers interesting, with respect and the quiet habit of already thinking 2 moves ahead. Soroth opened. We've been reviewing the Lex Bellum Universalis, he said. Formally, for the first time in 600 years, the review was triggered by the tribunal. By the doctrine, Chivas said. She was more precise than Soroth in this room, without the chamber's acoustics making every word feel larger than it was. Specifically, by what the doctrine identified. Okafor waited. 300 pages of tactics the Accords prohibit, Chivas said. Each one annotated with Earth's current doctrine and its relationship to Accord law. It is, functionally, a gap analysis, a document that shows exactly where the Accords prohibit behavior, without providing any structure for transition away from that behavior. You prohibited things, Okafor said. You didn't build a pathway. We assumed the prohibition was the pathway. You assumed every species would come in already on the other side of it. Chivas nodded once. Yes, we assumed civilizations signing the Accords had already resolved these conflicts internally. She paused. We were not thinking about civilizations that were still in the middle of resolving them. Or civilizations that were honest about still being in the middle, Okafor said. Soroth put a document on the table. It was shorter than the doctrine. Cleaner. The working draft of something that did not yet have a formal name. We're calling it Article 8, he said. Working title. Transitional Combat Doctrine. A formal mechanism by which any member civilization, at any point in their development, can document their current military doctrine, file it as a sovereign addendum, and receive a structured pathway toward full Accord compliance. Okafor read the first page. You're making what we did into a door, she said. We're making what you did into a door, he said. What you did was find a gap that existed because we never thought anyone would use it honestly. Subsection 9 was a formality, a grandfather clause for old wars. He looked at the document on the table. You used it for something new. You used it to say, this is what we are, and this is where we're trying to go, and we need legal space to exist between those 2 points. And now you want every civilization to have that space. We want civilizations that need it, to have it. Several member species, I will not name them, are currently conducting frontier conflicts using tactics that would trigger a tribunal if we looked closely. They haven't been brought here because looking closely has not been politically convenient. A pause. The Compact has a habit of ignoring what it doesn't want to formalize. Article 8 forces the formalization. If you document it, we see it. If we see it, we can build a transition plan. A pause. And if they won't document it? A pause. Then refusal becomes its own evidence. Okafor set the draft down. It's a good amendment, she said. We want your input on it, Soroth said. Your doctrine is the most detailed transitional document any civilization has ever produced. If we're building a framework, we want the perspective of the people who built the most honest version of it. Arak of the Vreth Makal spoke for the first time. His voice was the low subsonic thing that Okafor had read about in his file, but not yet experienced in person. She felt it in her sternum before it resolved into words. It was, she thought, one of the more honest voices she had encountered. It didn't perform its own weight. The broadcast, he said. Okafor met his eyes. He had 6 of them, arranged in pairs, and he used all of them. Your forces attacked after we signaled surrender. You claimed your command had not been briefed on our surrender protocol. Yes. I have reviewed your internal communications from that engagement. Command knew what the 12 tones meant. The working room was very quiet. Chivas and Soroth were both very still, in the specific way of people who had just decided to let 2 other people finish something. Okafor did not look away. Yes, she said. One word. The weight of a decision made under fire, with incomplete information, by people who had spent their entire professional lives learning to make the calculation faster than whatever was trying to kill them. Yes, she said again, we knew. Arak waited. The Accord says we cannot attack a surrendering force. It does not say we must believe a force is surrendering. Her voice was even. She was not defending herself. She was explaining. The way you explain something that has already happened and cannot be changed, which is different. Command made the assessment that the broadcast was a tactic, that a full disclosure of force, at that point in the engagement, served your interests better than ours. That waiting for you to regroup, under the cover of a surrender signal, was a cost we couldn't pay. They were actually surrendering, Arak said. Yes. She held his gaze. We were wrong. Another pause. This one had a different texture, not the silence before an argument. The silence after an honest thing lands in the right place. The decision to attack was wrong, she said. The decision to assess the situation before accepting the signal at face value, that's what Article 8 is for. The gap between having to make that judgment and having the legal structure to make it accountable. She looked at the draft on the table. If that amendment had existed 11 months ago, Command would have had to document the assessment in real time, file it, flag it for review. The decision might have been the same. It might not. But it would have been visible. Arak was quiet for a long time. Visible accountability, he said. Not a question. More like a man placing a coin carefully on a table to see which way it lands. It's the only kind that works. He looked at the draft. He looked at Okafor. He had the file on her. He had read it on the transport over, the same as she had read his. He knew her record. He knew the kind of officer she was. My government will want a provision, he said, for formal review of field assessments made in ambiguous signal situations. Not a prohibition. A review mechanism. That's reasonable, Okafor said. We will want input on the review standards. Also reasonable. Arak looked at Soroth. A moment passed between them, the specific look of beings in a room who have both survived enough to know that reasonable is harder than it sounds and rarer than it should be. The water dispenser made its question sound 32 times. By the end, the draft was covered in annotations from 6 different species, which is the shape any good law takes before it becomes a law. Article 8, Transitional Combat Doctrine, passed by unanimous vote 6 weeks later. It was not named after Earth. These things rarely are. The species who make a thing necessary rarely get to name it. But every delegate who worked on it knew the room it was drafted in, and the thermos on the table, and the woman who came into a tribunal built to make everyone feel small, and sat down exactly as if she had always planned to be there. The Vreth Makal War with Earth's 14th Expeditionary Force concluded by mutual armistice, 11 months after that. The terms were, by any honest measure, fair. Arak negotiated for his government. Okafor negotiated for Earth. They met 3 more times over the following decade. Once at a funeral for a Vreth Makal general who had been, in the technical language of the profession, an enemy. Once, without ceremony or explanation, at a dinner that neither of them later mentioned in official correspondence. They did not become friends. The word was the wrong shape for it. They became the thing that exists between soldiers who have fought on opposite sides of a real war, and come through it with enough respect left to be glad the other one is still alive. The Compact's 47 languages had words for this. None of them were quite right. The closest was probably the person across the wire that you hope survives the next one, which, coming from humans, was the most generous thing there was. And somewhere in the Compact's archive of legal instruments, between 4,000 years of war law and hard-learned prohibitions, sat a 300-page document filed on a Tuesday by a civilization that had been in space for 11 days and had known exactly what it was walking into. Not because they were arrogant, because they had read the map carefully and recognized every road on it. They had traveled all of them before.